Shalom. Also to the Kluge family on this very special Shabbat. So, it's smashed everywhere. Pieces of my favorite blue bowl filled with warm oatmeal fell off the table, spraying clay pottery everywhere, and oatmeal all over the floor, all over the table, and all over my suit. I was a mess, and I was in a big panic. I'd been invited by the governor to speak at a press conference about guidance that she was issuing regarding her executive order that ICE agents cannot simply enter sensitive places like our own synagogue, many other places, without a judicial warrant. And I needed to be at the State House on time. But as I'm sure it's happened to you, you might have been juggling too much, and I might have been. I was texting someone about a pastoral visit. I was on a Zoom call, and I was making my breakfast, and I was trying to tie my tie. Suffice it to say, I didn't have time to change my suit, and so quickly ran to the restroom, poured water all over it, and it kind of left a medium-ish residue. You can see it if you look at the pictures of me standing next to the governor at the press conference. I hope that people would think that it's like a kind of special, not well-known Jewish tradition to wear oatmeal on Thursday mornings. Not many of you are familiar with it. So I got in the car with the oatmeal all over, and I drove. Now, of course, it was rush hour. It seemed like everyone had forgotten to drive, forgotten to know how to drive, or maybe they just were all Boston drivers. People were going the wrong way. They were going like 20 miles an hour. They forgot that you could make a right turn on red. And as I drove, I started talking to myself, getting more and more frustrated. And then I have to say, whoever designed the roads in Boston was clearly not a linear thinker. Apparently the designers were cows, at least according to my grandmother. And these cows must have walked in circles and in circles. I'm trying to do my best to turn this way and that way and find like a little ramp here on the side and make a slight turn and loop under here and somehow get downtown. And so I continued talking to myself. Please let me not lose the ramp. I don't know where I am. Please, please, please let this be the right turn. Actually, that talking was probably more like a prayer. Finally, I got downtown, and then I have to park. Why? I actually found a parking spot on the street. Very excited. Kind of far away. I didn't know if I should take it. Maybe I could do better. You're doing that inner calculation. Should I gamble? Would my parking app even work? Should I just park in the garage anyway? Then I start running up the hill on Beacon Street to the State House. And sure enough, I'm really late, and I'm wearing these shoes that have no tread on them, and I'm sliding over the cobblestones, and I slip and fall. And then I'm really talking to myself. Why didn't I pick up the shoes from the shoemaker that are being repaired so I wouldn't have to wear this old treadless pair? Suffice it to say, there was a lot of talking to myself, and not all of it was positive. This morning we're reading from Parashat Naso, which contains the Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessing which Sarah insightfully introduced. And it also contains other sections. At the end of the parasha, each chieftain The head of each tribe is supposed to bring a whole bunch of gifts to the Mishkan, to the tabernacle or portable sanctuary in the wilderness as we traveled through the Sinai. And each of those gifts are the same list to show everyone is equal. It's a long, long list. And then in the last verse of the portion, after all of those gifts, all the ceremony, all that detail, the Torah says, "Uvedo Moshe Elohel Moed ledaber ito, v'yishma kol midaber elav, me'al hakaporet asher al Aaron ha'edut mibein shnei hakruvim v'yedaber elav." When Moses went into the tent of meeting to speak with God, you would hear the voice addressing him from above the cover that was on top of the ark of the pact between two cherubs. And thus God spoke to him. Now there's something very curious and very subtle that I never noticed before. The word that is used for speaking, that God is speaking, is midaber. Now, the usual way of saying it is midaber. God is speaking, like speaking to Moses. There's a fair amount of that in the Torah. But here in our verse, it says midaber. Midaber elav. Rashi, of course, right, our great French commentator that Sarah quoted from earlier, from Troyes, immediately picks up on this, as do others. First Onkelos, an Aramaic translator, many centuries earlier. And Rashi writes, "Kimo mit daber, kvodo shamala lomar kein midaber beino levein atzmo, Moshe shomea me'alav." It's like the word mit daber. Actually, I don't think is a word, but Rashi's saying it's like the reflexive form. Rashi writes, it's being spoken to itself. It's out of respect for the one above that the Torah says it this way. God was speaking between God and God's self, and Moses then heard it on his own. This is an unbelievable image. God is in this space speaking to God, kind of talking to oneself. And Moses is given the privilege of listening in on God's conversation. Moses, the greatest prophet in our tradition, does not simply receive dictation. He's not some kind of spiritual secretary. He enters into this tent of meeting, and somehow in this sacred space, he overhears God's voice, but it's God's inner voice. Or perhaps, as Professor Robert Alter, the scholar of Hebrew and comparative literature and one of the great translators of the Bible, explains in his commentary like this, quote, "The second linguistic anomaly of this verse is the use of the reflexive form of the word midaber instead of the usual midaber, speaking. It's also possible that the meaning is genuinely reflexive. The voice is speaking to itself. There seems to be a theological impulse here to interpose some kind of mediation between the divine source of the speech and the audible voice that is then spoken to Moses, which Moses hears. This is a kind of mediation. There is some interpretation here, because Moses isn't getting it directly. There is a listening that has to take place for Moses. There is a voice that is not so simple. It's not obvious. It's not straightforward and easy to hear. And all of that brings us to the great topic of what is prophecy. What is Moses doing? Because sometimes, certainly this is the way I grew up, I imagined prophecy was very simple. God is talking, God is speaking, the prophet hears, and the prophet repeats it. But our tradition is actually a little bit more complex, a little bit more nuanced, and actually a little bit more human. In his masterpiece, The Prophets, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a 20th century rabbi, professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, philosopher, civil rights activist, one of my father's teachers. He provides incredible insights into the prophetic process. He explains, quote, that the prophet is a person, first and foremost, not a microphone. The prophet doesn't merely hear the words and then transcribe them like some stenographer. Rather, Heschel writes, the prophet speaks from the perspective of God as perceived from the perspective of his own situation. I love that. The prophet speaks from the perspective of God, but as perceived from his own situation. That means that prophecy involves God's voice, God's teachings, God's ideas, but also the prophet's life. The prophet has to receive it, has to wrestle with it, has to interpret it, has to look and use it in the context and milieu of the world around him. And then the prophet has to have the courage to speak. Maybe that means that there's something sacred, or at least potentially sacred, in that simple act of inner speech. Now, not all self-talk is holy. As I was reminded in my car on the way to the State House, often our self-talk is anxiety or criticism. Why am I late? Why are the roads impossible? Why didn't I pick up my shoes? Why is there oatmeal all over my pants? But maybe the goal is not to totally stop talking to ourselves. Maybe the goal is to listen a little bit more carefully, filter out some of the noise, and find the voice of conscience. The voice says, breathe, show up. There are people who need protection. There are values that need defending. Now, I don't want to get carried away. I'm not comparing my oatmeal-stained commute to Moses in the tent of meeting. But our tradition teaches that God's voice is not always heard from some outside place. Sometimes the work is to discern from within all the noise which voice is worthy of being followed. That's what our great prophets did thousands of years ago. They saw what others had learned, but they had learned in a way where they didn't really see. What others had learned not to see. Think of the great prophet Nathan, who confronts King David and says he's behaving immorally. Think of the prophet Elijah, who confronts King Ahab. Isaiah's prophecy and calls to seek justice and defend the vulnerable against what he saw, the injustice of his world. Think of the great prophet Amos, who taught the line we just said in the prayer for peace, "Vayigal kamayim mishpat utzedakah kenachal eitan." Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness flow like a mighty stream. That's prophecy. Prophecy is not prediction. Prophecy is not fortune telling. Prophecy is not also being a microphone. It's seeing the world through God's eyes, through God's voice, and then understanding it and speaking. So, yes, some of my self-talk on Thursday morning was not helpful. But underneath it was a voice that was encouraging me. Keep going. Show up. There are people whose dignity, whose very lives are at stake. There are sacred spaces like our own that need to remain safe. There are Jewish moral teachings that need to be preached in public. And if you have to do that with a little bit of oatmeal on your pants, so be it. May we all quiet the voices that diminish us and strengthen the voices that call us to courage, that call us to act that call us to understand and hear beneath all the chatter that divine call to compassion, justice, and love. Shabbat Shalom.